All right, thanking and praising God for the chance to start yet another book of the Bible. Let's call Luke chapter 1. He will be great. Understanding that statement is actually going to come up two times in the chapter 1 with regard to John the Baptist, whose birth we're going to get an extended story about in chapter 1, but likewise in chapter 2, we're going to see the birth of Jesus foretold with an extended description of his birth and childhood in chapter 2. But the thing that they have in common, at least, is the description that both children are prophesied to be great. And understanding that we are starting out a new book of the Bible, I want to give a short overview, nothing too detailed, but simply focusing on the differences that I have seen between Luke and the Gospels we've seen to this point, Matthew and Mark. And one of those differences being, as I probably mentioned, an extended set of teachings between about between about chapter 12 and chapter 19, Luke's triumphal entry story that gives us more in-depth teaching regarding, I think at least two subjects. One, the kingdom of God, as we saw Matthew deal with at length, but in addition, some practical, what seems to be more practical insights into what it means to be a disciple or somebody who is actually patterning their lives after the Christ in hopes of reconciling their relationship with God. Understanding that even beyond his literal teachings or the additional literal teachings that we might see between chapters 12 and 18, there seem to be stories that we will see repeated from the description of his life in Matthew and Mark, but some seem to be duplicates, not duplicates of the exact same story, but duplicates of a similar or the same principle, understanding that twice we're going to see Luke describe Jesus issuing woes to either whole crowds or certain portions of crowds within Israel. Likewise, Lamentations, he's going to lament over Jerusalem more than once, and it's going to be one literal lament, like we said back in Matthew, and I think likewise in Mark's description of the life of Christ. But he's going to issue his mourning over Jerusalem at least twice, even if one of the instances is not specifically a lament. In addition to that, he will talk about the coming of the kingdom, meaning we talked about the ends of time in Matthew 24, not 14, Matthew 24. Likewise, we saw an extended description of his foretelling or his prophecies about the end of era and the end of all things in Mark. Likewise, twice he's going to project toward the future and help them get a better understanding of what end times might look like. And in addition, he's going to talk about the concept of wasting our talents more than once, using the phrase, the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away from him, seeming to be the summation of larger stories, at least in one instance, where he is talking about the way in which someone was given talents that they wasted. Talents literally meaning money in some of these stories, but more generally talking about opportunities to grow, an investment or something that was given to a person with the expectation that they would at least use it in the way that God had called them to use it, so that he would then be motivated to add the increase. Understanding finally that among the instances of duplicates that I saw or seem to see, at least at this point, is a duplicate regarding his famous adversaries from the previous two Gospels, the Pharisees, who in Luke's description of the life of Christ, he is twice going to rebuke for seeming to have more care for their own livestock than they do for the people under their care who needed help on the Sabbath. But with that, chapter 1, as we said, we want to look at from the perspective of he will be great, understanding that the he is both John and Jesus. Verses 1 through 4, setting the larger context, helping us in verse 2 to see that Luke may not have been an eyewitness to the things that he is writing about. Understand that he still wanted to give what he will call an orderly account of the things that happened in the life of Christ. For Theophilus, the name that you might already know, literally means the one who loves or one who loves God, maybe a proper name for an individual, but it might be a general address to others who he knows love the Christ and want to better follow his ways. Understanding that after the introduction in verses 5 through 25, we're going to get the description of the birth of John the Baptist as foretold, understanding that the actual story of his birth will come later in the chapter. And Once again, it seems that the ESV has done a great job of breaking up the paragraphs, and it might not be me just impressed with the ESV as much as this is a chapter with 80 verses, and I need their organization to keep it concise. So what I'm going to try to do is break down each of these sections, roughly giving you a logical or thematic point that I see so that we can keep it moving, and I can give you the larger point that I thought stands out about the greatness of both John and the Christ. Understanding that in that first section, talking about the birth or the foretelling of the birth of John the Baptist, it's going to be said that Zechariah, a priest, with a wife by the name of Elizabeth, were a righteous couple in verse 6, who, however, were barren, as we see in verse 7. Going on, though, it's not going to stay that way because the angel that we'll later learn is Gabriel is going to foretell, as we mentioned, the birth of their son, John. Understanding that he is going to specifically give them the name John. And that's going to be a thing later on because it's going to seem odd to name him John because of the tradition of the time, which seems to make it more likely for them to name him after either his father or someone in their line or that family's line. And John is a name that is strange for that family's line, but it comes from the angel. As we said, it's going to be an issue later. Either way, before we get there, we are going to see that in spite of the shame that goes along with Elizabeth's barrenness, John is going to turn that around, as we used to say back home, with a quickness, understanding that his birth is going to mark a new era of joy and gladness for Elizabeth and Zechariah, and not just them, but for the nation in general. Understanding that he is going to have an effect or an influence that's going to be persuasive enough that, as we said in life, not everybody is going to love him, but he is going to be influential in turning the hearts of the people back to healthy things. Most notably, he's going to notice that he's going to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, seeming the part of his blessing goes beyond, as we mentioned, his family too, helping aid the restoration of other families in Israel, thus quite possibly part of the reason for his influence. But beyond all that, after the foretelling of the birth of John ends with Elizabeth's thanks for removing, or the promise that her reproach will soon be removed. We will then see the foretelling of the birth of Jesus, likewise by Gabriel, this time to Mary in the famous story of his appearance, helping her to understand that in spite of the fact that she has never been with a man, it's still not impossible. God's going to make it happen. And an interesting contrast between the birth of Jesus foretold to Mary and the birth of John foretold to his father is that Zechariah does not believe, but he's going to say what seems to be literally the same thing that Mary is going to say in response to Gabriel's news. And we'll see in verse 18. And Zechariah said to the angel, "How shall I know this? For I am an old man and my wife is advanced in years." Gabriel's response to Zechariah is going to be, because you didn't believe, you're going to be mute for a while. However, Mary's going to seem to say roughly the same thing in verse 34, where it says, "And Mary said to the angel, how will this be, since I am a virgin?" But he is simply going to offer her encouragement and keep it moving. No punishment or anything like that. Why? I don't know. But we may see in the next section as Mary is told that it is not only her that should expect good news in the form of a new addition to the family, but likewise, she's going to be told about the news that Elizabeth has just got. And so she, in verses 39 through 45, is going to visit Elizabeth, who likewise seems to have gotten wind, whether it's simply by the prophecy or the spirit of prophecy or some other way. She already knows what's going on with Mary. How do we know? Because in verses 42 through about 44, it's going to say, "And she exclaimed with a loud cry, 'Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. And why is it granted to me that the mother of my Lord should come to me? For behold, when the sound of your greeting came to my ears, the baby in my womb leaped for joy. And blessed is she who believed that there would be a fulfillment of what was spoken to her from the Lord.'" And therein may lie the difference between the reason why what sounds like the exact same question from Zechariah and Mary got two completely different results. Understand that we often say the same act, depending upon the motive of the individual, can produce completely different results in two different individuals. And here, Zechariah's disbelief as compared to Mary's belief may be the reason why the same words, or roughly the same words coming out of both of them, got profoundly different results. However, both are going to end up having their tongues loose to the point where they are going to, at least Mary is going to praise God in what we call the Magnificat, her song of praise. Zechariah likewise is going to prophesy. After John is born and his tongue is loosed, he's able to speak again, praising God, and then at length thanking God for the blessing. And so Mary's song, thematically to me, seems to emphasize something super similar to Zechariah's song or prophecy from two different perspectives. In verse 48, Mary is going to say, "For he has looked on the humble estate of his servant, for behold, now all generations will call me blessed." In verse 50, she will go on and say, "And his mercy is for those who fear him." Likewise, I want to emphasize in Zechariah's prophecy after the foretelling of the birth of John, verse 75, where he says, let's start in verse 74, "that we, being delivered from the hand of our enemies, might serve him without fear in holiness and righteousness before him all our days." Likewise, I want to emphasize verse 79, where it says, "to give light to those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet in the way of peace." Understanding that, Mary emphasized not only the way in which God looks on those who are in really humble circumstances, but it's not just the humble circumstances. It causes him to have sympathy on their conditions, and sometimes in life flip the scripts on those who are sometimes looked down on or marginalized or cast aside. It is the degree to which they themselves, verse 50, fear him, and not with an idle fear, but a fear that causes them to want to improve their ways. Understand that we basically mentioned that part of Jesus's ministry is helping us understand the way in which we need to make changes that help us reconcile our relationship with God, or reconcile ourselves to God through improving our relationship with him. Which reminds me of the way that Zechariah closes out that chapter in verse 79, as we mentioned, thanking God for the way that he guides our feet in the way of peace, bringing back a familiar theme, helping us understand that it's one thing for God to give us peace, but it's another thing for him to counsel us in the ways of maintaining the peace. And as both Zechariah's family and Mary gets news that they're going to get a significant shift in their situation, the reason why they seem to be appropriate places for this favor, understanding that favor is one of those things that does not talk about your moral perfection as much as it talks about you presenting the kind of perspective that God is willing to work with. And even though we're going to see later on in the life of Jesus signs that Mary is not perfect, one of the reasons she may present herself as someone that God is willing to show favor to, someone he's willing to work with, is the fact that she knows it's more than the gift that she receives that's blessed. It's her response to it, seeking for God to use the child to guide her and others into the way of reconciliation. Something that likewise Zechariah seems to appreciate is thanks to God for not only giving them a blessing in a place where they once experienced shame, he's counseling them in the way to, once again, maintain the peace, but not simply maintain the peace for themselves, but to raise a child that will guide the entire nation in the ways of maintaining the peace that God intends for us all.